So on with the second half of this lecture, which is very specifically focused on art that responded to the AIDS HIV crisis, particularly in the late 1980s through the early 1990s, with a couple of exemplary artists of this time period. First, you will read, hopefully, in detail the kind of history of the rise of the AIDS HIV epidemic through the 1980s, where it gained great visibility. Smaller numbers of people than you would think originally, but definitely very, very difficult disease, particularly within the gay community of New York, where it became most visible in the 1980s. And then, of course, the governmental lack of action in response to this epidemic, because it was understood as a gay disease. It was so closely aligned with either gays, gay men in particular, to a lesser extent, gay women, lesbians, but also aligned with other forms of perverse moral action, such as intravenous needle users. The government just really didn't focus any attention on this problem at all, spent very little money on early on either developing cures or treatments or safe sex campaigns or anything. And rightly so, the gay community was quite outraged about this. What you're looking at on the screen is a poster created by the group ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, is what the acronym stands for, that uses the silence equals death slogan to promote the idea that remaining closeted or remaining private in your own sexuality could now literally lead to death. That there was in this moment such an urgency behind confronting the AIDS HIV epidemic that to remain silent was to, in a way, eschew your moral obligation to help others who are confronting this very problematic disease. Above that silence equals death slogan, you see the now famous pink triangle that is a form of appropriation. The pink triangle, or triangles in general, were applied to concentration camp victims in Nazi Germany to designate sexual perversion, most notably homosexuality. And by the way, you should note this is another really tricky subject, but if this were a much longer discussion, we would have to note the differences between homosexual men and homosexual women in this whole story, because even going back to the Nazis didn't believe that there were real homosexual women, that they were just kind of confused and that lesbianism was a stage, or it wasn't the same type of perversion that you associated with men. And those types of historical discourses actually inflect the sexual politics of each group, men or women, in this moment. In any case, one of the most notable campaigns in this early period of the late 1980s, this is a work from 1987. So at this point, there are about 600 confirmed deaths according to HIV. Is this campaign by ACT UP known as Let the Record Show, which was a series of images that look like this put into a storefront or a kind of entryway to a contemporary gallery, or it's known as a contemporary museum, but it's really a kind of museum without walls that move from place to place, on the subject of AIDS, HIV, as well as the kind of mainstream intolerance and very, very problematic language employed by primarily people on the far political right of the spectrum in response to gay and lesbian calls for more monies, more attention, more public programming dealing with this crisis. What you're looking at here, again, each one of these, as you will have read in Richard Meyer's work, had a public official or a government official who had said something that seemed antagonistic towards these proposed policies for change and dealing with AIDS, HIV. And in this case, you're looking at the image that was devoted to William F. Buckley, William, and I'll come back to what he said specifically in a moment here. The image itself then has an LED sign at the top, silence equals death, that we've talked about in the pink triangle that had been appropriated from the Nazis as a symbol of power by the gay community. And beneath that, you see a large photographic print of the Nuremberg trials. So directly referencing something that William F. Buckley will say, but also something even more kind of problematic in this association. The Nuremberg trials, of course, reference the Nazis and their program of tattooing sexual perverts, as they called them. But it also points to the way that these trials unfolded in the 1950s, where very prominent Nazis associated with the concentration camps all claimed either ignorance of this obviously very visible phenomena of the concentration camps, or said that they were just following orders. In other words, they all took no responsibility for being complicit in the activities of the concentration camps. This then is aligned with the position of the government, and even more specifically with William F. Buckley, who said in a New York Times op-ed piece that everyone detected with AIDS should be tattooed in the upper forearm to protect common needle users, and on the buttocks to prevent victimization of other homosexuals. So he's literally espousing the idea of tattooing people with AIDS so as to prevent the spread of AIDS in this incredibly, acerbic language. I'd just like you to think about, how this would make you feel at this time as your friends, your lovers, maybe even yourself are directly confronting this disease. Obviously, this is, in my estimation, about the stupidest idea that you could possibly have. It's certainly not going to spread or stop the spread of AIDS, HIV in any kind of real way. It does nothing to deal with questions of safe sex, which, by the way, the government was against. There's actually a law enacted, the so-called Helms Amendment, which is still on the books, about what can and cannot be taught in public schools, or rather be funded by public funds when it comes to questions of safe sex or homosexual activities. A whole host of things that are not being dealt with here. And the idea, of course, at root, that these victims of a disease should be, tattooed so as to stop the spread of the disease is just kind of the epitome of intolerance itself. So it's their way of outing these public officials and creating a dialogue around government inaction. A group of artists who were associated with ACT UP and had a lot to do with the Let the Record Show campaign then banded together and formed the subgroup called Gran Fury. Gran Fury oftentimes is talked about as the unofficial kind of propagandistic arm of ACT UP. The members, of course, shared both allegiances. They took their name in the first instance from the fury that they felt about government inaction, but also, ironically, to point the finger at where the problem was, from the name of the model of car, the Pontiac Gran Fury, that was employed by New York City cops at this time. That's what you're looking at here on the screen. Gran Fury and ACT UP, of course, beyond just the arts and creating slogans and creating T-shirts and so forth, took to the streets and rallies. Very, very activist group. Again, think of Richard Meyer's ideas about visibility and the importance of making visible the gay community and gay forms of same-sex desire and so forth here. And I'll just show you a couple of these images because, in a way, the art was at the service of creating these kinds of communities and creating a constituency around a shared, very urgent problem that didn't exist before, that maybe one could feel safe in the privacy of one's own home and one's own life, not needing to be vocal about one's own sexuality, but now that took on totally different consequences in this realm. So the art, in a way, is both in the service of, as well as a component of, this larger field of political agitation and activism that was so much a part of the late 1980s into the 90s. And these T-shirts were oftentimes created by Gran Fury and worn in these political rallies. One of Gran Fury's first very, very notable campaigns was the Read My Lips campaign. And you're looking at the poster that was created for these. It's actually a campaign that was to promote the idea of kiss-ins. So we'll start with that. The kiss-ins they started off as a day in which all around various cities, primarily in Manhattan at this point, same-sex couples would make themselves visible by showing same-sex affection. So you see at the bottom of this, on Friday, April 21st, at these different times in these different venues, gay and lesbian couples would show their affection in public. Now, as Richard Meyer points out, the meaning of a same-sex kiss is not the same as a heterosexual kiss, which can be taken just simply as two people, showing their affection towards one another. A same-sex kiss is something that was oftentimes very private, was very, very rarely shown in any kind of media, let's say from television to movies of the time. So it is a form of claiming of one's identity and a form of being intolerant to intolerance, right? I'm not going to keep my desire private. I'm going to show you that I exist and that this is my, this is my sexuality in a very public way. It is a form of claiming and being proud of one's own sexuality here. The poster itself, though, has a number of innuendos to it. Read My Lips is a play off a campaign promise made by the first George Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, who, coming after Reagan, of course, who was the first to not put any money into AIDS, HIV, promised no taxes, right? Read My Lips, no more taxes. Now they've appropriated this from George Bush, who, as you've seen just recently in those pictures, was one of the key villains for this community. So as to say, read my lips, but in this case, the lip reading has to do with same-sex affection here. Furthermore, the couple that is kissing here, two sailor boys, has its own innuendo as well. The image was something that came from what is best kind of known as vintage homoerotic pornography that was illicit, that was, frankly, it was illegal. And so it was something that was a kind of carefully guarded secret passed among members of the gay community in secret, in private, that is now being made public. Now, they've made this just about kissing, but just like the Andy Warhol work that has a certain kind of innuendo, or if you're an insider, further resonances of the image, that image actually comes from this original photograph that is much more sexually explicit. So you can imagine members of the gay community gaining a different kind of resonance for this image, a much more sexual resonance for this image if they're aware of this original photograph. But they're not showing this to the public. It's not really, as Richard Meyer points out, about same-sex eroticism when these two are kissing. It's about same-sex affection. It's about making visible, the homosexual communities of the world, and making people have to confront that they exist in the world rather than remaining silent. The other poster for the lesbian community looked like this. Again, same idea, but the image is quite different. The image in this case was taken from a poster for a Broadway theater production of the mid-1920s called The Captive, that was first performed in 1926, that dealt with same-sex couples, in this case lesbian couples, and is one of the very first to ever do this in New York, and as you might imagine, it was immediately censored. As a matter of fact, the producer and the main actress here, the kneeling actress, were actually arrested for obscenity charges, and then very quickly, within months, and if you know anything about the government, getting legislation passed in months is extraordinary. Laws were put on the books against the representation of any kind of same-sex affection, and they remained on the books into the 1960s, believe it or not. So there's a kind of historical resonance here, the importance of standing up and representing same-sex affection and the historical consequences of this and the need to change that deep history of intolerance towards same-sex affection. As Richard Meyer often also points out, though, when this was shown to the lesbian community, there was a little bit of an uproar about how incredibly detached the same-sex affection looks, right? It doesn't look like the two sailor boys kissing, and that fell too easily into the stereotype that lesbianism was more about kind of an emotional connection than any kind of sexual connection. And so although the poster wasn't ever changed, when this campaign continued on, they substituted a Victorian photograph of two women kissing, and this was put on T-shirts and carried through the streets and so forth here. I'm not sure they've solved anything. These two women don't look like the two sailor boys to me. The one that looks like she's kind of laughing her way through it rather than really being involved in the kiss, for instance. But what is meant to be pointed out is that Gran Fury had a kind of internal mechanism for dealing with internal criticisms of their campaigns, and they oftentimes responded to this very directly. Then, and it's not so directly linked to this, but this is certainly a component of it, of course, the kiss-ins gained a kind of a higher degree of resonance when it was made public that the famous heartthrob, very masculine, kind of leading man actor Rock Hudson had HIV and was dying of HIV. And now there's a fear in the public about how many of his leading ladies would end up having AIDS, HIV because of the kiss. This then pointed to all the misinformation about the transmission of AIDS, HIV, that it could be passed through saliva. And frankly, you know, with the fear around this disease, it's not surprising that people would be incredibly, let's say, sensitive to the possibility of transmission. But, you know, the evidence was all in. Transmission through saliva was not really a possibility here. No one, absolutely no one scientifically could confirm anything like this. So it was all just about a kind of mythology about this. And frankly, you know, Rock Hudson was the least well-known or least best-kept secret gay man in Hollywood. Everyone who was in Hollywood knew forever that this man was gay and very sexually exuberant in his activities as well. But wondering whether Linda Hamilton would come down with HIV was, you know, part of that kind of media furor that the U.S. public went through at the time. In response to that, then, Gran Fury kind of one-upped their kiss-ins and Read My Lips campaign to the so-called Kissing Doesn't Kill campaign. And they got some money thrown at them, or rather they went out and sought that money from a group called the American Foundation for AIDS Research, or AMFAR. So what you see here is the original poster that was intended to go on billboards and on buses and on trains and be put out into the public realm to promote the idea of people becoming self-educated about the transmission of AIDS, HIV. They've obviously kind of appropriated the famous Benetton commercials about mixed-race couples, but in this case, what they're showing are mixed-race and same-sex couples kissing. And originally, this poster read as it does here, "Kissing doesn't kill, greed and indifference do." And then it had the political rejoinder at the bottom, "Corporate greed, government inaction, and public indifference make AIDS a political crisis." Now, when AMFAR adopted or agreed to pay for this campaign, they made ACT UP and Gran Fury drop the political rejoinder at the bottom. So the subsequent posters only said kissing doesn't kill, greed and indifference do, which left it a little nebulous as to what the political kind of bent was of this, that it was about corporate greed and government inaction and people not being very interested in this problem because it was a gay disease. When these went up on buses and billboards and so forth, of course, there was an outcry from various elements of the public, again, primarily the far right. And in this case, the long story that is told by Richard Meyer about this campaign is that originally, various members of society, particularly government officials, stood up and said that this needed to stop. And one of the arguments, the most kind of vociferous arguments, was forwarded by Robert Shaw in Chicago, who was somehow in charge of public transit and so forth, who actually said, as you will have read, that these posters functioned more as recruitment of youths to become gay and lesbian than they did to raise public awareness about anything. And in a sense, the dropping of the political rejoinder at the bottom that would have made it much more overt what this program or this campaign was about led to that type of misinterpretation. Now, for the life of me, this has always been something that I've never quite been able to wrap my mind around, that young people, when seeing same-sex affection, would somehow immediately, become gay. It just seems preposterous to me, but that's oftentimes the type of fears that you see articulated in the public realm by, in particular, political figures who want to create wedge issues and really raise the fears of others around them. Mothers and fathers worrying about little Johnny being gay, and if he somehow sees two men kissing, suddenly he's become gay, I suppose, is the logic. Which, as I said, I don't know who's ever bought that, but in any case, that was the argument. So this recruitment of adolescents idea then immediately took on a legislative, position where laws or particular, I don't know if they're exactly laws, but forms of legislation were enacted so that no same-sex affection could be shown to anyone underneath the age of 18, were put onto the books in Chicago very briefly, and then they were, of course, attacked by the ACLU as well as many other political advocacy groups for minorities and taken off the books immediately, but not before public officials, and famously Robert Shaw again, saying, well, if you won't allow the government to legislate the representation of these images of same-sex affection, the public will take it into their own hands, which was not very kind of quiet way of exhorting the public to vandalize these images. And within a couple of weeks of these things going up, over half of them were publicly defaced throughout Chicago and elsewhere. So now I just want to show you another arm of Gran Fury, the political propaganda posters that were usually carried through political rallies or gay rights rallies or gay pride parades or what have you, but also plastered on telephone poles and on walls and so forth to make more visible the problematic of AIDS, HIV. And I'm just going to kind of show you a number of these. They're oftentimes very, very oppositional. You can read them as full of a lot of, righteous anger here. This is another one that's a big issue, the idea of, in particular, contraception, the idea that, of course, and we still have it today in the public school system to some degree, that teaching people how to have safe sex is somehow going to promote the idea of them having sex, and so we can't teach it in one way or another, or all of the religious kinds of counters to the idea of using contraception, especially the Catholic Church, which just notably recently with our new Pope has given the nod to perhaps the possibility of people using contraception in response to the outbreak of that virus in South America in particular. But by and large, of course, the Catholic Church and most Christian organizations are pretty averse to contraception because of the reasons that I stated. I mean, I remember when I was teaching at Seattle University, which is a Jesuit school, various gay and lesbian rights groups would not come to campus because as a Catholic organization, Seattle University would not allow them to pass out condoms, and they just wouldn't come. And think of that in relation to the AIDS crisis that now torments so many people in Africa in particular, and continues today in the United States. There's been a resurgence of this. And then the indictment here of the Catholic Church. And I will say this, it's worth pausing here to note that this type of oppositional strategy used by ACT UP and Gran Fury, while completely understandable, is met with a similar kind of counter-oppositional force, particularly from the right. It's almost never a good idea to take on the Pope, pace Donald Trump these days, because people really feel like that, that's going against something that is, not an appropriate target here. And I guess what I'm saying here is that we see this over and over again, particular tactics adopted by people that, in this case, for instance, I find to be incredibly correct in their assertions, need to be taken into account when it comes to the effectiveness of their tactics. So, for instance, if you are, and rightly so, let's say, critical of the Catholic Church for denying people the use of contraception and how problematic that is when the transmission of AIDS, HIV can be very, very limited through the use of simple condom use, it may not be the best way to achieve your results by being so oppositional, although I understand the anger and I understand the righteousness. One of the most important artists of this period, he's not aligned with ACT UP or Gran Fury, but of course took place in any number of these rallies, is David Voinovich. And he represents kind of the most overt activism of this group, the most kind of anger represented by this group. And next week I will come back to talk about some of the censorship that you will have read about, particularly with respect to his writings. But here I want to focus on just a couple of works from the Sex series, which were also censored in their own way. But again, I'll come back to that next week. Here we're just going to look at what he's up to. David Voinovich was one of the many artists who in the 80s and 90s had AIDS, HIV, and perished of that. The other major artists that we'll be looking at here, Felix, Gonzalez, Torres, also died of HIV. His work takes a number of different approaches. This is, I think, one of the most kind of effective of all of his works and the easiest to explain, frankly, without a ton of background for it. The Sex series are a series of negatively printed silver gelatin prints that combine kind of everyday mundane areas of the public realm. So for instance, here a forest with these little spherical apertures of various scenes, primarily of homoerotic sex acts, homosexual sex acts, although it's very hard to tell exactly what you're looking at here until you get up very close, and that's part of what these things are about. These then are meant to be displayed obviously in the public realm, and in a sense they bring up a number of things for me. When I first saw these, I didn't know much about David Voinovich. I went to a show when I was, most of your ages in the late 1980s, right at the height of this this, I guess it was early 90s, right at the height of this, this discourse around AIDS, HIV, and came across these images. They're very kind of ghostly when you first look at them. It takes a while to figure out what you're looking at, and they almost solicit you getting up close and looking at them to see what is in that spherical space. And then once you do, you oftentimes have this kind of feeling of immediate self-consciousness. You're looking at, gay erotica, and whether you are gay or lesbian or heterosexual, seeing this in public with other people around you makes you very, at least for me, very self-conscious about what I was looking at. As Richard Meyer has said, when you look at these spherical insets, and I'll show you another one here, against this kind of mundane background of the public world, one of the things that occurs to you is that it's almost like you have kind of looked through a keyhole onto another world that could be, for instance, in this image, in any one of these apartments or under a bridge or who knows where. Like you're getting a close-up of an activity that's going on that you're unaware of in the world. So that's one part of it. Again, making visible same-sex erotica here in this venue. The other thing, though, is that these images are once again taken primarily out of gay vintage porn, which then leads to some members of society being able to recognize that more quickly than others and have that other kind of signification for these images, partaking of that realm of homosexual activity. The further point about these, though, is one that I'm just going to read you what David Voinovich said about his work. He said, quote, "The spherical structures embedded in the series are about examination and or surveillance." Think about that, it's both, examination or surveillance. Looking through a microscope or looking through a telescope, or the monitoring that takes place in looking through the lens of a set of binoculars. It's about oppression and suppression. So that's one component of it, right? Having to hide it, seeing it, voyeuristic activity and so forth, or being surveilled, thinking of yourself as constantly being looked at, being surveilled by, the authoritative system. Think of all those things we talked about with the panopticon, with self-surveillance, and how that kind of image of heteronormativity exists within the heads of all of us, and having to think of yourself through that kind of normative principle of sexual activity and how that then works on you. Are you comfortable looking at these images, David Voinovich goes on, of obvious sexual acts in a crowded room, meaning the gallery space? Do you fear judgment if you pause for a long time before an image of sexual expression? Can you sense absurdity or embrace in the viewing of images? So in a sense, one other component of this is, how does it make you feel? How does it make you reflect upon your own, perhaps, homophobia or your uncomfortable, feelings in front of seeing same-sex expressions in the realm of the public, in a gallery space? What do you do with that? Again, it's not overt. These, as many commentators have pointed out, the spherical structures and the erotica that you see is not meant to titillate, really. It's not very focused in on all the things that, erotic images oftentimes have, the beauty of the body, the specifics of the sexual act, the expressions on the faces. If anything, they're more like emblems of same-sex erotica. Now, with that being said, of course, these images, for those who know what the original image is, who have seen this firsthand, and many people would have, has a different resonance for them. It's a little bit more overt for them because it might recall memories of the original image, and I just show you a couple of these here. Now notice what the difference is between these overt images that are meant to incite kind of desire versus the ones that are the spherical insets that are more like emblems of homoerotic desire. A number of the sex series images, about 3, as I recall, have multiple spherical insets, and this one that is talked about by by Richard Meyer, I've chosen here today. So we see again the public sphere, the train. We imagine, for instance, the spherical inset up on the upper right as maybe evoking sexual activities that are taking place in the train. But there's a kind of vectoring of all these images, or correlation of all the spherical images. And if we look down at the far lower right-hand side, and you start reading what is in there, this is clearly a newspaper article that's talking about gay bashing, or some kind of interaction between intolerance and homosexuals. On the lower left-hand side is a close-up of blood platelets, so bringing up the AIDS HIV epidemic and all of the fear that fostered within the United States. And then up in the upper right, and for the first time, this is an image that is not printed as a negative. It is an actual positive image, so you can really see it well. Is an image of a police kind of anti-riot task group with rubber gloves on, going into a gay rally. And it turns out this is actually a gay rally that David Voinovich was a part of here. And so all of these things kind of going together. And we are to make sense of these, like how does one foster the attitudes or the actions of another? How does fear about AIDS, HIV lead to gay bashing, lead to the breakup of gay pride rallies? How does fear about homosexual activity, again, lead to all of these different manifestations in the United States at this time? Interestingly enough, and there's a longer story behind this, and I will come back to part of that next week, but might as well reference this now. In the early 90s, I believe it's the early 90s, a number of the sex series photographs, images were included in a work called, or an exhibit called Tongues of Flame at Illinois State University Art Gallery. And part of this was funded by a National Endowment for the Arts grant. This is all happening, by the way, very soon after the famous Andrea Serrano Piss Christ incident that I'll come back to next week. So there's already a lot of vocal activity on the floor of the Senate and so forth around the National Endowment for the Arts funding artworks that are seen as either anti-Christian or anti-heterosexual. It's always the anti, right? Not pro something else. And one of the key movers and shakers in this whole story, a friend of Jesse Helms, is a man by the name of Reverend Donald Wildman, who was the leader of a group, a very right-wing Christian group known as the American Family Association. And what he did was he decided, in order to raise the ante on the question of governmental funding for the arts, to produce his own flyer, and you see that here on the screen in front of you, by taking parts of David Voinovich's works, some of which weren't even included in the Tongues of Flame exhibit, crop them, put them together into this flyer, along with a long, pointed commentary on what your tax dollars are funding and whether or not these are works of art and so forth. He then packaged these in envelopes. A lot of money went into this, by the way. Packaged these in envelopes that stated that don't look at these. There's very, very inflammatory images in these. Caution, and then sent these flyers out to about 200,000, both government officials, members of the American Family Association, and like-minded folks, in order to raise their ire about what the government was funding when it came to the realm of visual arts. So I show you the back side of this flyer here. Notice how he's cropped out all of the, just about everything, right? All of the public images, anything having to do with the politics of this, and all he's showing you is the gay erotica. Up in the far left-hand corner too, this really ticked him off. That's an image that comes out of another work by David Voinovich that wasn't included in the show, as far as I know, on Jean Genet, the gay playwright, kind of member of the dissident surrealist group, who talks in his own work about his experience and outsider status and, the trials and tribulations of being a gay man. And in this case, Voinovich has accompanied that image with, here it is, the full image of Voinovich. Genet is in the foreground here, with an image in the background of Christ, on the cross, but in this case being a needle user. Now, he's not trying to say that Christ is a heroin user or something of that sort. He's trying to say that there's a coincidence between being an addict and being a martyr, and yet by taking it out of that, it can be totally misconstrued. In any case, on the one hand, Reverend Wildman's campaign worked, and it worked wonders, and we'll talk about that next week, because a lot of people got very upset about their tax dollars being used to fund these kinds of artistic activities, and we're going to have, I hope, a healthy discussion around this next week. But on the other hand, it was a moment for David Voinovich to strike out against this appropriation of his art. So he took Reverend Wildman to court, and the American Family Association to court, and he sued them for, if I remember correctly, libel and copyright infringement, and he won. Now, because the judge found that this didn't necessarily impact the monetary value of Voinovich's work, he was only awarded $1, but he insisted that this amount be paid in the form of a check and signed by Reverend Donald Wildman. He never cashed that check, and later on it's been exhibited. It was his own private work. So, one of those stories here. The other thing, though, is he got a judgment that forced Wildman to send out to everyone that he had originally sent out these flyers to an apology and an explanation for what he had done, and the determination of the court on this issue, although I'm not sure that changed anyone's mind. The damage had already been done in that realm. Then he became a kind of icon for the censorship of the arts, and this is the famous cover of High Performance magazine, which is an alternative arts magazine in which they have kind of photo-doctored his face as if his lips are being sutured together, and used, again, media sources to continue the counterattack against the far right of the political spectrum here. As David Voinovich was dying of AIDS, HIV, he created a number of photomontages that are about this subject of his own fate. This is one of the most powerful of those. Again, if you don't know what this is about, you don't know that it's about AIDS, HIV, you still get a sense of the trauma and the tragedy. These are American bison that appear to be falling off of a cliff into this crevasse. And we actually know that, of course, this was one of the tactics used by usually the U.S. Army to kill off the food sources for the Native Americans. So a way to, again, marginalize and, frankly, exterminate people. It almost seemed to many that the right in particular, and to a large extent the complicity of the general American public, would just assume that this supposed gay disease kill off this constituency of the United States, and it was doing so. One of the most powerful for me of all David Voinovich's works is his kind of last work. It's untitled, as most of his are, but it's usually referred to as Bandaged Hands. These are his own hands in the last kind of days of his life, where he wrote an essay about his experience of dying, of perishing as a gay man with AIDS, HIV. You will read about this in Richard Meyer. He'll kind of parse it and go through all the stages of it, but let me read it to you now aloud as well, and just kind of let your own thoughts flow over you as you're hearing this. It's about visibility and invisibility. The text in red reads, "Sometimes I come to hate people because they can't see where I am. I've gone empty, completely empty, and all they see is the visual form, my arms and legs, my face, my height and posture, the sounds that come from my throat. But I'm fucking empty. The person I was just 1 year ago no longer exists, drift spinning slowly into the ether somewhere way back there. I'm a Xerox of my former self. I can't abstract my dying any longer. I'm a stranger to others and to myself, and I refuse to pretend that I'm familiar, that I have a history attached to my heels. I'm a glass, clear, empty glass. I see the world spinning behind and through me. I see casualness and mundane effects of gesture made by constant populations. I look familiar, but I'm a complete stranger being mistaken for my former selves. I'm a stranger, and I am moving. I am moving on two legs, soon to be on all fours. I am no longer animal, vegetable, or mineral. I am no longer made of circuits or disks. I am no longer coded or deciphered. I am all emptiness and futility. I am an empty stranger, a carbon copy of my form. I can no longer find what I am looking for outside of myself. It doesn't exist out there. Maybe it's only in here inside my head. But my head is glass and my eyes have stopped being cameras. The tape has run out and nobody's words can touch me. No gesture can touch me. I've been dropped into all of this from another world and I can't speak your language any longer. See the signs I try to make with my hands and fingers? See the vague movements of my lips among the sheets? I'm a blank spot in a hectic civilization. I am a dark smudge in the air that dissipates without notice. I feel like a window, maybe a broken window. I am a glass human. I'm a glass human being disappearing in rain. I'm standing among all of you, waving my invisible arms and hands. I am shouting my invisible words. I am getting so weary. I am growing tired. I am waving to you from here. I'm crawling and looking for the aperture of complete and final emptiness. I am crawling and looking for the aperture of complete and final emptiness. I am vibrating in isolation among you. I am screaming, but it comes out like pieces of clear ice. I am signaling that the volume of all this is too high. I am waving. I am waving my hands. I am disappearing. I am disappearing, but not fast enough. David Voinovich, as well as being an extraordinarily gifted visual artist, was also an extraordinarily gifted writer. As you can see, his mechanism here is a kind of stream of consciousness that runs back and forth. And this untitled image, Buried, that he created not long before that. Another artist of this group, of this time period, very, very well known, but who represents an entirely kind of different strategic approach to these questions, is Felix Gonzalez Torres. Felix Gonzalez Torres' works are oftentimes untitled as well, but they almost always have a subtitle, such as this series that is known as the Perfect Lover series, which are light bulbs and clocks in particular. Unlike David Voinovich and many of the works that you've seen so far, Felix Gonzalez Torres' works are not a particularly easy target for those who are intolerant of gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender activities or political stances. But they're also very effective. What he does here and what you're looking at, and you'll see many manifestations of this, are two light bulbs that are plugged into the wall, whose cords kind of snake in and out of one another and are entangled, go up on the wall and hang there, shining very brightly. If you think of this as a couple, you know, one of the things that is happening here is that we have the beautiful illumination of their love, the entangled bodies or the entangled lives that are here together. But we also have something else that is looming. One of these bulbs will burn out before the other. This is something that sometimes happens when these things are hung on the wall, one bulb over over the course of the exhibition will burn out before the other. Now, for all of us, it doesn't matter what our sexual orientation is, how we identify in the world. I think pretty much everyone wants to be loved and wants that kind of intimate relationship with others. So we can all kind of respond to this empathetically on a human level, almost a universal level. But knowing that this is a gay artist and knowing the impact that AIDS HIV had on this community and how so many were left without their loved ones, it has that resonance as well. But as I said at the beginning, it's not an easy target. It's pretty easy to take, for instance, David Voinovich to task for showing, homosexual erotic images if you're on the extreme right. It's much harder to argue against a light bulb. Entire communities affected by this. And of course, the same thing happening with these clocks. These are battery-operated clocks. They're set in tandem with one another at the start. Again, until the battery runs out, they run, simultaneous to one another. A couple, in concert with one another. But inevitably, one of these clocks is going to stop before the other, and then the other's going to stop after that. And, they're very poignant, very kind of universal gestures. And I think many people respond to these in a way that the more confrontational strategies of David Voinovich pushed some people away. And it was something that was a kind of learning situation for the activist groups at this time. His Gonzalez Torres' approach actually began to be adopted by Gran Fury later on in various ways. And by the way, just anecdotally, I want to share this. Very first time I taught a course like this, I taught it out of necessity, again at Seattle University. I felt like it was absolutely essential that these courses be taught in a venue that implicitly and sometimes overtly had stances against or intolerance against homosexuality. When I showed this to my class, their eyes lit up. Everyone got exactly what this was, and within a week, every clock in the art building had been stolen because people were putting these up in their own rooms. This then went on to another very poetic gesture by Felix Gonzalez Torres, the so-called bed billboards that went up all around, I believe these were in Manhattan. He got a campaign together and he shows these beautiful kind of white linen beds with the imprints of two bodies that are now no longer there. And of course, on the one hand, so much of the public probably initially had no clue what these were about. So they're not a target that you can attack, right? You don't know what the resonance of this is supposed to be. You might even believe this is some kind of, advertisement for some kind of, sale at the local bedding store or something of that sort. But word of mouth was used to spread the message of these works. This is about the absence of that couple anymore, the absence of intimacy, the bed that people share, now only left with these kinds of indexical marks of the bodies of those people who are no longer there. And people educated one another on this by word of mouth to say that, one component of this, a very important component of this, had to do with Felix Gonzalez Torres being a gay man who had lost his lover, Ross Laycock, to AIDS, HIV, and the impact that this was having on loving communities of same-sex couples all over the world. So you would learn about this by saying, I'm just going to make up a hypothetical. Hey, have you seen those weird bed billboards around? What do you think those are about? And slowly but surely, by word of mouth, the message of these were passed around. Now, once again, it doesn't provide a very strong target to react against, and that's part of the incredible kind of ingenious of the strategy here. It also draws people together into dialogue about the meaning of these in a way that perhaps is more intimate and gains greater meaning in that way than just seeing an image in a gallery space. Finally, as with so many of these works of art that are untitled, they have this hidden resonance to them that you only learn about kind of secondarily. I remember this work being set up in the hide and seek show, which you will have read about, and more recently something like this set up in the recent show at the Tacoma Art Museum on AIDS, HIV, up to the current day that just came down a few months ago. I hope some of you saw that. These are, again, this one's untitled. It's usually untitled, called USA Today. They oftentimes have subtitles that are either the birthday of his deceased lover or the body weight of his deceased lover before he got AIDS. And you are invited in the gallery space to come take these. These are little pieces of candy. So they're a gesture of offering, of a little bit of sweetness, some kind of memory of these beautiful, foil wrapped candies that everyone wants to take. But they're bittersweet because every time you take one of these candies, of course, if you know that these are about his lover and his demise, and you think about the ravages that the body goes through when it has HIV or AIDS, and how deteriorated and how much weight is lost and so forth. Every time you take one of these candies, in a way, you're taking part of that body weight in a sense, or you're being complicit in the death of someone, or you're thinking, it's more important to put it this way, you're reflecting upon your own inactivity in relation to this epidemic. And that's kind of the double bind of these works. They are sweet gestures. They are something that are meant to implicate you, meant to make you reflect upon your own contribution or complicity in the advance and spread of this epidemic. I said before that Felix Gonzalez Torres' work was very effective in bringing together communities and sharing ideas and providing a very slippery target for the far right in particular. It was a strategy that later on was adopted by Gran Fury. Gran Fury kind of unofficially disbanded in 92, I think. And yet they continue to produce as artists independently or without any kind of public acknowledgement that it's Gran Fury. And this is just one final example from this period. This is just a simple, very poetic, very kind of universal set of questions. These things were wheat pasted onto walls all around the United States. It reads, "Do you resent people with AIDS? Do you trust HIV negatives? Have you given up hope for a cure? And when was the last time you cried?" Now, this isn't, of course, the end of the story. There are AIDS and HIV is still around today. There are many different forms of artistic activity within the gay, lesbian, bi, transgender communities. Self-identified queer artists are doing their thing as well. But this was the moment in time in which most kind of visibly the gay community, and to a lesser extent those who felt allegiance with this gay community, came together and had to bond together and create common strategies for both making their own concerns and identity visible, as well as agitating against the inaction of the government and the larger body of the American public. Well, kind of sad for me. I want to end this by just saying every time that I give this lecture, it feels like the first time that I'm giving it. I know many of you as well probably know people who either live with or died from AIDS, HIV. But as I came up as a young graduate student in the early 1990s, I was surrounded by the gay community. There are a lot of gay and lesbian people in the arts, obviously. There are a lot of gay and lesbian people in many forms of culture in the wider world, but it seems very, very concentrated in the art world. And I lost a lot of friends during this moment. So thanks for thinking about this. And I hope we have a great discussion this week on the topic of prejudice against people of non-heteronormative sexualities.